What if the biggest war of this decade is about to end quietly, without anyone declaring victory? What if the missiles that were supposed to protect a regime for 30 years are the very reason that regime is now sitting across a table, begging for a deal? Before we go any further, if you want to actually understand what is happening in the Middle East right now, instead of just scrolling past confusing headlines, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the story is moving fast, and I break it down in a way nobody else does. Let me take you back to February this year, because you cannot understand what is happening today without understanding how this all started. On February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against Iran. This was not a small operation. This was not a warning shot. This was a full-scale war that began with airstrikes hitting military sites, government buildings, and command centers across the country. And in the opening hours of that campaign, something happened that almost nobody predicted. Several senior Iranian officials were killed, including the supreme leader himself, Ali Khamenei. Think about that for a second. The man who had led Iran since 1989, the man who had survived decades of sanctions, assassination attempts, and international pressure, was gone within hours of the first strike's landing. This did not come out of nowhere. For months before the war started, Iran and the United States had been sitting across from each other at the negotiating table, trying to reach a new agreement over Iran's nuclear program. Those talks dragged on. They stalled. They broke down. And while the diplomats were still talking, the military planners were already preparing something very different. When the deal did not come together the way Washington wanted, the airstrikes came instead. It was, by every measure, one of the most dramatic escalations in the modern history of the Middle East. Now here is where I want you to really pay attention, because this is the part most people misunderstand. Iran's missile program was not just another item on a list of military assets. For more than 3 decades, it was the entire foundation of how Iran defended itself and projected power. Iran could never compete with the United States or Israel in the air. Their air force is old. Their pilots do not have access to modern fighter jets the way Western nations do. So instead of trying to win in the sky, Iran built an enormous arsenal of ballistic missiles on the ground. The idea was simple. If you cannot stop us in a dogfight, we will make sure that attacking us costs you more than you are willing to pay. That was the entire logic behind decades of investment, engineering, and secrecy. Think about what it actually takes to build a program like that and keep it running for 30 years straight. You need engineers who are trained well enough to design and improve missile systems generation after generation. You need factories that can produce these weapons at scale, even while your country is under some of the harshest economic sanctions in the world. You need underground facilities strong enough to survive an attack from the most advanced militaries on the planet. And you need to do all of this quietly, without giving your enemies a clear picture of exactly how far along you actually are. Every single one of those requirements costs enormous amounts of money, time, and talent. Iran poured all 3 into this program for 3 decades, because its leadership believed, correctly or not, that this was the one thing standing between them and a much more aggressive foreign policy from the West. This is also why the missile program became one of the very first and most important targets once the war began. Destroying missile factories, storage sites, and launch positions was not just about winning battles. It was about breaking the psychological and strategic backbone of the entire regime. When your enemy's whole defense doctrine rests on one type of weapon, taking that weapon apart does more damage than any single battle ever could. It does not just remove hardware, it removes confidence. It removes the sense of security that an entire government had built its survival strategy around for a generation. The war did not stay confined to just Iran's borders either. Within days, the fighting spread outward like ripples in water. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq began targeting American positions. Missiles were fired at Jordan. Attacks hit Kuwait, including strikes on facilities that provide power and clean drinking water to millions of people. When you attack a country's water supply, even indirectly, you're no longer just fighting soldiers. You are affecting ordinary families who have nothing to do with the politics driving this war. That is one of the most painful truths about modern conflict. The people who suffer the most rarely have any say in how it starts. Then came one of the most serious moments of the entire war. Iran launched missiles directly at a U.S. base in Jordan. 2 American soldiers were killed. Another went missing. For the United States, this was the line that could not be crossed without a direct and forceful response. Within hours, American forces carried out what officials described as a heavy wave of strikes against targets inside Iran. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was retaliation on a scale meant to send a message that could not be misunderstood. From that point forward, the war followed a brutal and exhausting rhythm. Strike, counterstrike, missiles launched from Iran, intercepted by air defense systems in Jordan and Bahrain, American and Allied aircraft hitting targets deep inside Iranian territory night after night. At one point, the United States carried out 8, then 9 consecutive nights of strikes. Explosions were reported in cities like Bandar Abbas. Reports emerged that a strike had even hit an unfinished nuclear facility, prompting international nuclear watchdogs to step in and start asking serious questions. Every single night added another layer to a conflict that was already reshaping the entire region. I want you to sit with something for a moment. This is not a story happening far away with no real consequences. Every time a missile was launched, real families were hiding in shelters. Every time a strike was ordered, real pilots were flying into contested airspace, knowing they might not come home. War is not a headline. It is thousands of individual moments of fear, courage, and loss happening at the exact same time in different corners of the same region. As the campaign continued, one of Iran's most powerful tools of pressure became the Strait of Hormuz. If you do not know why this matters, let me explain it simply. A huge percentage of the entire world's oil supply passes through this narrow stretch of water every single day. Ships carrying crude oil from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Iraq all have to pass through this one channel to reach the open ocean. There is no easy detour. There is no simple alternative route that can carry the same volume. Iran effectively shut it down during the fighting, and that single decision sent shockwaves through global markets. When oil cannot move freely, prices rise everywhere, from gas stations in America to shipping costs in Europe to fuel prices in countries that have absolutely nothing to do with this war. Iran understood exactly what they were doing. If they could not win militarily in the way they wanted, they could still make the entire world feel the pain of this conflict through its economy. This is actually one of the smartest strategic moves available to a country that cannot compete militarily with a superpower. You do not need to win on the battlefield if you can make the cost of the war unbearable for everyone else watching from the outside. Iran turned an economic chokehold into a bargaining chip, and for a while, it worked exactly as intended. Now, if this is the first part of the story you needed to understand, let's talk about what has been happening more recently, because the picture has shifted in a way that very few people saw coming just a few weeks ago. If this story is opening your eyes to how connected all these events really are, do me a favor and tap that like button right now. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who are trying to understand what is actually going on instead of just reacting to scary headlines. By late July, the president had grown increasingly frustrated, warning publicly that the United States was prepared to hit Iran even harder, describing potential strikes at a scale not seen since World War II. That kind of language is not used casually. When a sitting president compares the potential scale of military action to the largest war in human history, it tells you just how seriously escalation was being considered behind closed doors. This was not a throwaway line for a press conference. This was a deliberate signal aimed directly at Tehran, meant to make clear that the United States still had far more capability in reserve than what had already been used. But then something shifted. On the very same day that warning was made, the president also said he had agreed to hold off, to give diplomacy one more real chance for what he described as the future benefit of both the world and Iran itself. That single sentence is one of the most important moments in this entire story, because it marks the point where the conversation started moving from purely military to genuinely diplomatic. It is worth asking why that shift happened at that exact moment. Threatening overwhelming force and then immediately offering restraint is a classic negotiating tactic, one designed to make the other side feel the full weight of what could happen next, while still leaving a door open to avoid it. Behind the scenes, countries like Qatar, Oman, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia had been working urgently to prevent the conflict from spiraling even further out of control. Saudi Arabia's leadership reportedly raised direct concerns about further strikes on Iran during private conversations, pushing hard for de-escalation. This is a critical detail that a lot of people miss. Saudi Arabia has its own complicated history with Iran, yet even they understood that an even larger war in the region would threaten everyone, including themselves. Sometimes, the clearest signal that a situation is dangerous is when even rival nations start pushing in the same direction, toward peace instead of further escalation. When two countries that have spent years competing for influence across the Middle East suddenly find themselves on the same side of a diplomatic push, that tells you something about just how serious the risk of further escalation had actually become. Oman in particular played a role that deserves more attention than it usually gets in mainstream coverage. Oman has spent years positioning itself as a quiet, trusted mediator between Iran and the West, precisely because it maintains relationships with both sides that few other countries in the region can match. Without that kind of behind-the-scenes channel, a war like this one becomes far more likely to spiral completely out of control, simply because neither side has a reliable way to signal restraint to the other. By the start of August, real negotiations began taking shape. focused specifically on reopening the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping. Qatar's government described the talks as being in very progressive stages, with drafts of a potential agreement already being circulated between the parties involved. Let that sink in. A conflict that began with assassinations, airstrikes, and the deaths of American soldiers was now, just months later, being discussed in terms of drafted agreements and diplomatic frameworks. Of course, nothing about this has been simple or straightforward. Iran's own negotiators have made it clear they are not approaching this from a position of surrender. One member of Iran's negotiating team stated plainly that the goal is an arrangement where, in his words, Iran is dominant, insisting that matters like security and maritime services in the Strait should be handled by Iran itself. This tells you something important. Even a country that has just endured months of devastating military strikes, the loss of its top leadership, and severe damage to its most prized strategic program is still negotiating from a place of pride and defiance, not defeat. That posture is not just for international audiences, it is also for Iran's own population and its own political establishment, who need to see their leadership standing firm, not simply surrendering to Western demands after months of loss. There has also been real confusion and conflicting messaging on both sides. At different points, Iranian officials have publicly denied that any negotiations were even taking place, while American officials, including the president himself, insisted that talks were ongoing and going well. Iran's parliament speaker went so far as to accuse Trump of what he called theater diplomacy, suggesting that public statements about progress were more about optics than actual substance. Whichever side you believe, one thing is certain. When two nations cannot even agree publicly on whether they are talking to each other, the situation remains incredibly fragile, no matter how close a deal might seem. This kind of contradictory messaging is fairly common in high-stakes negotiations, where both sides often want to control the narrative for their own domestic audiences. And even as these talks have progressed, the danger has not disappeared. Just recently, Saudi Arabia issued a serious warning, stating they were bracing for what they described as multiple coordinated attacks from Iraqi militias working together with Houthi forces in Yemen, allegedly under guidance from Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Think about the timing of that warning. It came at the exact same moment negotiations were said to be heading in a positive direction. This is the harsh reality of conflicts involving proxy groups. Even if the main players, the United States and Iran, want to step back from direct confrontation, there are other armed groups across the region who do not answer to a negotiating table and who may act entirely on their own timeline. This is exactly why I said earlier that this story is not simply about missiles being destroyed or a deal being signed. It is about understanding how deeply interconnected this entire region has become. A shipping deal in the Strait of Hormuz affects oil prices worldwide. A militia attack in Iraq can derail months of careful diplomacy in a single night. A statement from Saudi Arabia can shift the entire tone of negotiations happening thousands of miles away. Nothing here happens in isolation. Let's talk about what has actually been accomplished from a military standpoint, because this matters enormously for understanding where things stand today. Iran spent well over 30 years building an underground, hardened, and deliberately dispersed missile infrastructure specifically designed to survive exactly this kind of sustained military campaign. Tunnels dug deep into mountains, storage facilities reinforced with layers of concrete, mobile launchers constantly moved to avoid detection. All of it engineered around one central assumption, that no single campaign, no matter how intense, could permanently cripple their deterrent capability. And yet, the campaign that unfolded from February through the following months represented sustained pressure on exactly that infrastructure, night after night, week after week, using a combination of airstrikes, cruise missiles, and precision-guided munitions. Whether or not Iran's missile capability has been completely eliminated is genuinely uncertain, and any honest analysis has to admit that. But what is far less uncertain is this. A program built to survive isolated strikes was tested against something very different, a prolonged, multi-front campaign that also took out senior leadership, damaged infrastructure well beyond military sites, and pushed the country to a point where diplomacy suddenly became the more attractive option. This is where I think the most important lesson of this entire story lies, so stay with me here, because I think this is the part that puts everything else in perspective. We are now more than halfway through this story, and if you are still with me, that tells me you actually care about understanding what is happening in the world instead of just consuming another shallow headline. So do me one favor, share this video with one person who keeps asking you what is actually going on with Iran, because chances are this explanation will make more sense to them than anything they have seen so far. Wars rarely end the way people expect them to. They do not usually end with a clear winner standing over a defeated enemy, waving a flag. More often, they end the way this one appears to be ending, with exhaustion on both sides. economic pain that becomes impossible to ignore, and leadership on every side eventually realizing that continuing to fight costs more than continuing to talk. Iran is not sitting at this negotiating table because they suddenly decided diplomacy is a better path out of goodwill. They are there because months of sustained pressure, military losses, economic damage from a closed strait, and the loss of their own top leadership created a situation where continuing the fight became increasingly difficult to sustain. At the same time, the United States is not stepping back from further strikes purely out of restraint either. There is real political and economic pressure at home to avoid an even larger, longer, and more expensive war, especially one that keeps sending oil prices climbing and puts American service members at continued risk in a hostile region. War is expensive in ways that go far beyond the cost of missiles and aircraft. Every extended deployment costs money. Every additional carrier group sent to the region costs money. Every dollar spent overseas is a dollar that domestic politicians eventually have to explain to voters who are watching gas prices rise at home. Diplomacy, in this case, is not simply the nicer option. It is very often the more practical one for both sides once the true cost of continued fighting becomes impossible to ignore. I also want to address something that I think gets lost in a lot of the coverage of stories like this one. We talk about missile programs, strategic deterrence, and negotiating leverage, and it is easy to forget that every single one of these decisions affects real human lives. Real families in Iran have spent months living under the constant threat of airstrikes. Real American soldiers have been deployed to bases across the region, knowing they could be the next target of a missile attack. Real workers in Kuwait have been killed simply because they were near infrastructure that got caught in the crossfire of a much larger geopolitical struggle. And when we talk about the strategic value of a missile program or the diplomatic value of a shipping deal, we are really talking about whether ordinary people get to live their lives without the fear of sudden violence hanging over them. There is also something worth understanding about how fragile any deal that comes out of this moment will actually be. Even if a full agreement is reached over the Strait of Hormuz, even if shipping fully resumes and oil markets stabilize, that does not automatically mean lasting peace across the wider region. Iran's influence has never depended only on its own missile arsenal. It also runs through a wide network of allied groups, including Hezbollah in Lebanon and Houthi forces in Yemen, both of which retain significant firepower of their own. A ceasefire or agreement between Washington and Tehran does not automatically silence every group that has, for years, drawn its confidence and its resources from Iran's backing. That is exactly why Saudi Arabia's recent warning about coordinated militia attacks matters so much. It is a reminder that peace at the top level of two governments does not always translate into peace on the ground, in the places where these proxy groups continue to operate. Let's take a moment to really understand this proxy network, because it explains so much about why this conflict is so difficult to fully resolve. Hezbollah in Lebanon has spent decades building one of the largest non-state military arsenals in the world, with direct backing from Iran in the form of weapons, funding, and training. The Houthis in Yemen control large parts of that country and have shown repeatedly that they are willing and able to launch attacks on shipping in the Red Sea and missile strikes toward neighboring countries. Various militia groups in Iraq operate with varying degrees of loyalty to Tehran, some tightly controlled, others acting with a surprising amount of independence. None of these groups exist because Iran created them from nothing. They exist because Iran spent years cultivating relationships, providing resources, and building influence in places where local governments were often weak or divided. That kind of influence does not disappear just because Iran's own missile program has been damaged and its leadership has changed. It is woven into the fabric of politics and security across multiple countries, and untangling it will take far longer than any single negotiated deal over a shipping lane. I want to walk you through why this particular moment, right now in August, is so genuinely significant, more significant than most people realize while scrolling past these headlines. For an agreement over the Strait of Hormuz to even reach the drafting stage, both sides had to accept some very difficult realities. Iran had to accept that its position, at least for now, is not strong enough to keep the strait closed indefinitely without facing consequences that its own economy simply cannot absorb. The United States had to accept that a full, permanent military solution, one that completely and forever eliminates the threat from Iran, is not realistically achievable through airstrikes alone, no matter how effective any single campaign might be. That mutual recognition, uncomfortable as it may be for either side to admit publicly, is usually what real turning points in long conflicts actually look like. Not triumphant victory speeches. Not one side completely collapsing. Just two exhausted powers slowly, carefully, and often reluctantly finding their way back toward a table they walked away from many months earlier. Now, let's talk about what comes next. because I think this is where a lot of coverage completely misses the point, and where you can actually walk away from this video understanding something most people simply do not. If a deal over the Strait of Hormuz is finalized, watch closely for three things. First, watch oil prices. If shipping genuinely resumes at scale, you should see global energy prices begin to ease. And that will be one of the clearest signs that this agreement is actually holding rather than just existing on paper. Markets tend to tell the truth faster than politicians do. If oil prices stay stubbornly high even after an agreement is announced, that is often a sign traders do not fully trust the deal to hold. Second, watch the militia groups. If attacks from Iraqi or Houthi forces continue or increase even after a formal deal is announced, that tells you Iran's central government may not have full control over its own network of allies. Or worse, that certain factions within Iran's own system may be actively trying to sabotage the agreement from within. This is one of the trickiest parts of any deal involving Iran. Even if the government in Tehran genuinely wants peace, it does not always have complete, unquestioned control over every armed group operating under its broader influence. And third, watch how Iran rebuilds. Every credible analyst studying this region expects Iran to attempt some level of reconstruction of both its missile capability and its underground infrastructure. The real question that matters going forward is not whether they try. It is how quickly they are able to do it, and whether the international community responds with renewed pressure or simply allows the process to continue unchecked. Reconstruction. After a war like this one is rarely quick or easy. It requires rebuilding not just physical facilities, but also technical expertise, supply chains for specialized materials, and the kind of stable leadership needed to manage a long-term strategic program. All of that becomes significantly harder when your top leadership has just been eliminated and your economy is still absorbing the shock of a closed shipping lane. I also think it's worth being honest about the limits of what any single deal can actually accomplish here. Even in the most optimistic outcome, where the Strait of Hormuz reopens completely and shipping returns to full capacity, this does not mean the underlying tension between the United States and Iran simply disappears. Decades of distrust, going all the way back to 1979, are not resolved through one negotiated shipping arrangement. What a deal like this can realistically achieve is a pause. It can achieve breathing room. It can prevent the kind of catastrophic region-wide war that seemed genuinely possible just a few weeks ago, when the president was openly warning about strikes on a scale not seen since World War II. A pause is genuinely not nothing at all, ever. In a region that has seen this much bloodshed in such a short period of time, a genuine pause, one that allows families to stop living in fear of the next airstrike, is worth taking seriously, even if it is not a permanent solution. It also helps to zoom out and think about how this fits into the much longer history between these two countries. The relationship between the United States and Iran has been defined by hostility, mistrust, and periodic crisis for well over 4 decades, ever since the revolution in 1979 that transformed Iran's government completely. There have been hostage crises, proxy conflicts, sanctions regimes, cyber operations, and moments of quiet, cautious diplomacy scattered throughout those decades. And what makes this current chapter different is simply the scale and directness of what happened. Assassinating a sitting supreme leader, striking nuclear infrastructure directly, and sustaining 9 consecutive nights of strikes represents a level of direct confrontation that goes well, beyond almost everything that came before it in this long, difficult relationship. That is precisely why the current movement toward negotiation feels so significant. It is not simply another cycle in a familiar pattern. It follows the most intense and direct confrontation between these two nations in the entire history of their conflict. Here's something else I think deserves real attention, something that connects everything we have talked about back to where we started. Iran's missile program was never simply about weapons sitting in storage facilities. It represented an entire philosophy of survival, one built patiently over 30 years by a regime convinced that overwhelming firepower was the only reliable way to guarantee its own continued existence. That philosophy has now been tested in the most direct way imaginable, through sustained war, through the loss of its top leadership, through economic pressure severe enough to push the government toward the negotiating table it had avoided for years. Whether that philosophy survives this moment intact, or whether it forces a genuine and lasting shift in how Iran approaches its own security. In the years ahead is one of the most important open questions in the entire region right now, and honestly, nobody, not analysts, not officials, not journalists, can answer it with full certainty today. There is one more angle worth thinking about before we close this out, and it has to do with what this entire episode teaches other nations watching from a distance. Every government in the world that has ever considered building its own version of a deterrent arsenal is watching exactly how this plays out. If Iran emerges from this war, having lost significant strategic capability and still being forced to negotiate from a position of relative weakness, that sends one very clear message to other regimes considering a similar path. If, on the other hand, Iran manages to quietly rebuild and eventually reassert the same level of regional influence it held before February, that sends a very different message entirely. The outcome of this specific conflict will likely shape how other governments around the world think about the value and the risk of building their own strategic deterrent programs for decades into the future. If you have made it this far, you already understand this conflict better than most people who only skim headlines without ever asking why any of it is actually happening. Let me leave you with the one thought I think matters most from everything we have covered today. Wars that begin with overwhelming force do not always end in overwhelming victory. Sometimes they end in exhaustion. Sometimes they end in quiet, uneasy negotiation, with both sides walking away claiming just enough to save face while neither one gets everything they originally wanted. That may be exactly what is unfolding right now between the United States and Iran. Not a clean, dramatic ending. Not a moment you will see clearly marked in history with a single decisive headline. Just a slow, fragile, complicated shift from war back toward an uncertain kind of peace, playing out in real time, right in front of us. If this deal holds, it will not be because either side truly trusts the other. It will be because both sides finally understood that the cost of continuing to fight had become greater than the cost of finally choosing to talk. And that, more than any missile, any airstrike, or any single dramatic strike overnight, is what will actually determine what the Middle East looks like for years to come.